Section 1. The World of 1899. Picture a country that is not quite sure what it wants to be yet. It is 1899, and America is holding two completely different versions of itself in its hands at the same time, one in each fist, and it is squeezing both of them, hard, not yet willing to let either go. On one side, you have the open frontier, the plains rolling out for hundreds of miles in every direction, the rivers cold and clean enough to drink from, the mountains still wearing their snow in September. You have men riding horses across land that no law really claims yet, where the nearest sheriff might be 4 days' ride away, and the nearest telegraph office even further. You have campfires and open sky, and the particular kind of silence that you can only find when there is nothing between you and the horizon, for as far as you can see. And then on the other side of those same fists, you have something new pressing in from every direction. The railroads have been threading themselves through the landscape for decades now, stitching town to town, city to city, pulling the world smaller with every mile of track laid. The oil companies have started pushing into territories that nobody thought were worth anything, and it turns out the ground under the grass is lousy with black gold that the industrialists want desperately. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, which is not a government body, but might as well be, has been operating since 1850 and has spent the last half-century building a reputation as the most effective private police force in the country, chasing outlaws, strikebreakers, anyone the paying client wants chased. And the paying clients are almost always the men with the most money: robber barons, railroad magnates, oil tycoons, men who have built their fortunes not through outright theft, exactly, but through something close enough to it that the distinction barely matters in practice. Men like Leviticus Cornwall, who is fictional but is drawn so precisely from the real figures of that era, from the Vanderbilts and Rockefellers and Carnegies, that he might as well be a portrait. Cornwall is a man who has never in his life gotten his hands dirty and never intends to, who sends other men to do the dirty work, who sees the landscape not as land but as property, not as territory but as assets on a ledger. When his train gets robbed, he does not shrug it off. He sends the Pinkertons. He sends them with instructions to not come back until the problem is solved. The problem, from Cornwall's perspective, is the existence of people who do not respect that the rules have changed. Men and women who are still operating according to the older logic, the one where, if you were fast enough and smart enough and willing enough to take the risk, you could live outside the lines the world tried to draw around you. That older logic is not entirely wrong. It is just running out of room to be right in. This is the world Red Dead Redemption 2 drops you into. Not a world of simple heroes and simple villains, though there are moments of both. A world caught in the middle of a transformation that nobody asked for, and almost nobody is handling gracefully. The frontier is closing. The thing that people had spent the better part of a century romanticizing, the wide-open West, where a person could ride for days without seeing another soul. That thing is being eaten alive by progress and by greed dressed up as progress. And the people who built their lives around it are being given a very clear message: adapt or be consumed. The towns scattered across the game's landscape tell this story just by existing. Valentine is a cattle town, rough and loud, full of cowboys driving cattle through streets, thick with mud and manure. The saloon perpetually crowded, the jail perpetually occupied. It feels like a place from a different era, already slightly out of time even in 1899. Rhodes, down south in Lemoyne, is something else entirely. It is a town still living in the shadow of the Civil War, still carrying that particular wound that never healed properly, still organized along lines of family loyalty and old grudges and a racial hierarchy that the war was supposed to have changed and mostly did not. The Greys and the Braithwaites have been fighting each other for longer than anyone can quite remember now, making the streets dangerous and the politics complicated, and the locals deeply tired of both. Saint Denis sits at the far end of the map and is the game's version of New Orleans, a city built on trade and culture and excess, and the particular beauty that comes from mixing so many different peoples in one place for so long. But it is also the most modern place in the game, and in 1899, that modernity has a specific flavor. The streets are beginning to be lit by electric lamps. The newspapers are full of advertisements for patent medicines and industrial products. There are automobiles, just barely, owned by the very wealthy and regarded with a mixture of fascination and deep suspicion by almost everyone else. The architecture is ornate and beautiful and grand, the product of wealth accumulated over generations, wealth built in ways that the city has never had to fully account for. This tension between the old world and the new one is not just scenery in Red Dead Redemption 2. It is the engine that drives everything. Dutch van der Linde and his gang are not simply outlaws in the neutral sense of people who break laws. They are people who are being made obsolete, who can feel that obsolescence coming, who are reacting to it in different ways and with different amounts of self-awareness about what is actually happening to them. Some of them are trying to outrun it. Some of them are trying to fight it. And one or two of them, the ones who will survive, are slowly learning to accept it, even if acceptance feels very much like loss. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, in the real world, was founded by a Scottish immigrant named Alan Pinkerton in Chicago in 1850. It grew into something enormous and powerful and deeply controversial. The Pinkertons were hired by railroad companies to hunt down labor organizers. They were hired by mine owners to break strikes. They were hired by corporations to intimidate workers who were trying to organize for better conditions. By the end of the 19th century, the Pinkerton Agency had more agents than the United States Army had soldiers, which gives you a sense of the scale of what private money could assemble when it was motivated enough. In the game, Agent Andrew Milton and his associate Edgar Ross represent this organization. Milton is the face of it, the one who does the talking, the one who delivers the ultimatums and makes the sales pitch for surrender. Ross is quieter and harder to read, and considerably more dangerous in a way that is not immediately obvious. He is the one who will still be working, still be methodical, still be patient enough to wait years for the right moment. If you have played the original Red Dead Redemption, you already know what Ross eventually becomes and what he eventually does, which gives every scene he appears in a particular cold quality. The world that Red Dead Redemption 2 builds is one of the most detailed fictional environments ever constructed in a video game. 29 square miles of landscape that includes mountain ranges, still wearing their winter snow well into spring, vast stretches of great plains where the grass moves in the wind, and the distant thunder of a coming storm can be heard before a single cloud appears. The swampy lowlands of Lemoyne, where the air is thick and warm and full of insects, and the trees have grown so dense they block out whole portions of the sky. There are rivers cold enough to slow your horse, deserts that shimmer in the heat, forests where bears live and leave their tracks in the mud for you to find days later. And everywhere you go, there are people. Not just quest givers or merchants, but people with routines and conversations and reactions to what is happening around them. Farmers complaining about the weather, travelers who have opinions about the railroad, an elderly woman feeding deer at the edge of a wood at dusk every day, rain or shine, a man sitting on a porch in a rocking chair, doing nothing, watching the road. None of these people are story critical. You do not need to talk to them to complete the game. But they are there anyway, filling the world with the texture of something that feels genuinely alive. All of this is the backdrop against which the story of Dutch van der Linde and his people unfolds. A story about loyalty and betrayal, and what happens when the thing you built your identity around starts to disappear beneath your feet. A story about violence and what it costs, slowly, over time, even when you survive it. A story about a man dying of a disease that will not hurry, who finds in his remaining months something he perhaps never quite found in his years of health. And a story about what it means to be a family, the kind you choose rather than the kind you are born into, and what happens to that family when the person who held it together starts to come apart at the seams. Before any of that, though, before the Blackwater Massacre, and the mountains, and the snow, and the Pinkertons, breathing down every neck, before all of it, two men try to rob each other at a campfire on the road to Chicago. And one of the greatest stories in the history of video games begins. Before we go any further, drop a comment down below, letting me know what time it is where you are, and what part of the world you are watching from. It is always something special seeing where people end up finding these videos. And if you are enjoying it, hitting subscribe means you will never miss the next one. Section 2. Two Men at a Campfire. The Birth of the van der Linde Gang. It is sometime in the mid-1870s, and the exact details of that first meeting are the kind of thing that becomes mythologized over time, as foundational stories always do. By the time Arthur Morgan is old enough to hear it told around campfires, it has probably been polished a little, given the right rhythm, made to sound more like fate and less like coincidence. But here is the shape of it. Dutch van der Linde is traveling the road to Chicago, and he is young, and he is already the kind of person who takes up a lot of space even when he is being quiet. He was born around 1855, somewhere outside Philadelphia, to an English mother named Greta, and a father who was Dutch by birth, which is where the name comes from. His father went and fought for the Union in the Civil War, and did not come back from it, killed in one of those battles that history recorded, and then mostly forgot the way it forgets, thousands of individual deaths that are each somebody's whole world ending. Dutch was very young when that happened, young enough that the loss shaped him before he had words for what was being shaped. His mother, Greta, raised him alone. By the time Dutch was 15, the relationship between them had become difficult enough that he left. He just walked out of whatever life he had and onto the road, the way some young men do when the weight of a place becomes heavier than the risk of having no place at all. Greta died in 1881, and Dutch found out about it months later from an uncle. The way you find out about things, when you have deliberately put distance between yourself and the people who might tell you. He carried that news quietly. He did not talk about his mother much in the years that followed. But before all of that, on the road to Chicago, Dutch is carrying whatever he has managed to accumulate, which is not much, because Dutch has been living by his wits for years now, taking what he needs by whatever method seems most practical at the time. He believes at this point in his life in a particular version of freedom, which is the kind that involves owing nothing to anyone and explaining yourself to no one. He has opinions, and he is not shy about sharing them when the mood is right. Opinions about the railroads and the land companies and the government and the general direction that America seems to be heading. Opinions that could be described as anarchistic if you wanted to give them a label, though Dutch himself would probably reject the label on principle. Hosea Matthews is on the same road that night. Hosea is older than Dutch, born sometime around the 1840s, and he has been a working con artist for most of his adult life. He had a period as a stage actor, genuinely talented, with real ambitions toward comedy that the world never quite gave him the stage to pursue. He got into petty theft, and it turned out he was very good at it, then better at the long con, at the performance of being trustworthy, at the particular art of making people want to believe you. A sheriff in some forgotten town once tried to hang him for stealing a chicken, which is the kind of detail that makes you understand what kind of world Hosea was navigating, one where the punishment for minor theft could be your life. He escaped. He kept moving. So there they are. Two men with their own designs on each other's valuables, both executing their plans at the same time. And the result is that they both end up realizing they have been had simultaneously, which under the right circumstances, with the right people, is not humiliating but hilarious. They laugh, and then they talk, and somewhere in that conversation, something clicks into place that will last for the better part of 30 years. What Dutch has, that Hosea does not, is vision. Not just a plan for next week or next month, but a genuine, fully formed idea about what kind of life is worth living, what kind of world is worth trying to build, even in the margins and the spaces that the official world has not yet claimed. Dutch believes in something. He believes in it the way some people believe in religion, which is to say with enough conviction that it stops needing to be justified. The belief is something like this, that a person's life should belong to them, that freedom is not a luxury but a right, that the machinery of civilization, with its laws and its taxes and its systems of who owns what, is a cage that most people have been born into and have never thought to question. This is a philosophy that sounds beautiful at a campfire. It sounds less beautiful when you look at what it costs other people to maintain, but that is a reckoning that is still decades away. What Hosea has, that Dutch needs, is practicality. Hosea is the one who knows how to actually do things, the one who can talk his way into a room and then out of it again, the one who knows when a plan is workable and when it is going to get everyone killed. He is also someone who has been alone on the road for a very long time, and Dutch, for all his talk of freedom, offers something that Hosea has not had in years: the prospect of company. Real company, the kind that involves someone who actually knows you and sticks around anyway. They become partners. They run cons together, fraud being their most natural shared territory, though they are not above the occasional robbery when the situation calls for it. At some point they get arrested, and then they escape, because escape is something they are both good at, and after that they commit more fully to the outlaw life as a career choice rather than an occasional detour. They pick up Arthur Morgan not long after escaping from jail, when Arthur is around 14 or 15 years old. Arthur's father, a man named Lyle Morgan, was a petty criminal who had been arrested for larceny in 1874 when Arthur was 11 years old. Arthur's mother had already died before that, the cause unknown. So Arthur has been effectively alone in the world for years, making do with whatever he can find, surviving in the way that children with nobody looking out for them sometimes manage to survive, by being tougher than the circumstances, by learning quickly, by not letting himself feel too much of what he is actually feeling, because feeling it would take energy he cannot afford. Dutch and Hosea find him, or he finds them, and the distinction matters less than what happens next. They take him in. Dutch teaches him to read. He teaches him philosophy. He teaches him to shoot and to ride and to look at the world through the particular lens that Dutch uses, the one where the gang is the family, where loyalty to your people is the highest moral principle, where the law is the enemy and the enemy deserves whatever it gets. Arthur learns all of it. He absorbs it the way a person absorbs the beliefs of the parent who raises them, which is not entirely consciously, which means it goes deep. He becomes Dutch's enforcer, Dutch's right hand, the one you send when you need the thing done reliably and with force if necessary. He is enormous and capable and quietly, methodically violent when violence is required, and beneath all of that, he is a person who loves, with a loyalty that is almost painful in its completeness. He loves Dutch the way a son loves the father who saved him. He loves Hosea with a gentleness he shows almost nobody else. He loves the gang as a whole, not as an abstraction, but as specific people with specific faces and specific habits that he knows the way you know the rooms of a house you have lived in for years. The gang had other members in those early years who matter even if the game does not always put them at the front. There was a woman who would become one of the most essential structural presences in the gang, Susan Grimshaw, who served as its administrator, which is not a glamorous word for a glamorous job, but is the accurate one. Susan kept order in camp. She enforced standards. She was the one who told people to pull their weight and meant it, and she had a way of saying it that made very large and very dangerous men quietly go find their contribution to make. She kept the peace in the small daily ways that actually sustain a community over time, the peace that is not about grand principles, but about who washes the dishes and who takes the watch and who is expected to show up for the work that nobody wants to do. She loved Dutch in the way that some people love the first person who gave their life a context it needed, and she served the gang with a completeness that never asked for much acknowledgement, because the acknowledgement was not the point. The point was the gang. The point was the community that Dutch had built and that Susan maintained daily, quietly, as essential to its survival as any of the jobs that got more credit. Lenny Summers is young enough that the game handles his death with a particular cruelty of timing, killing him before he has had a chance to be fully known. He is smart and fast, and a little bit showing off about both, the way young men who know they are good at something tend to be, but not in a way that is unpleasant. He laughs easily. He has not yet had enough time for the weight of the life to settle on him the way it settles on Arthur. There is something about Lenny that makes the older gang members protective of him in an unspoken way, the way adults are protective of young people who have not yet learned how much things can cost. Sean Maguire is from Ireland, and he behaves approximately the way a person behaves when they learn from an early age that the most reliable way to get through a difficult situation is to be louder and more confident than the situation warrants. He is brave in the reckless sense, which is a kind of courage, but not the most expensive kind. He takes risks that make other people nervous and then laughs about them afterward, which is charming until suddenly it is not. He genuinely cares about the gang, with a warmth that is sometimes easier to feel through his actions than to hear in his words, which are mostly jokes and challenges, and the particular music of someone who grew up speaking around the point rather than directly at it. Javier Escuela comes from Mexico, from circumstances that the game only sketches the outline of, involving political instability and violence, and the specific kind of displacement that comes from a country that cannot figure out how to hold its most vulnerable people. He is a talented musician, one of the only people in the gang who plays. And there are nights when he sits by the fire and plays, and the music is genuinely beautiful, the kind that makes people stop what they are doing and be still for a moment. He is loyal to Dutch in a way that outlasts what might be its reasonable justification. That loyalty is not a character flaw. Exactly. It is the loyalty of someone who found safety in a place and cannot easily imagine safety existing elsewhere. Bill Williamson is the most difficult gang member to talk about, without some version of either sympathy or contempt, and the honest answer is that he probably deserves some of both. He has a violent streak that the gang accommodates because the gang has need of people who do not hesitate when hesitation would cost them, and because the tolerance is part of what Dutch's philosophy of taking people as they are has always required. He is also a person whose self-loathing runs deep and directs itself outward in ways that make him dangerous and unpleasant, and, in his worst moments, genuinely cruel. He stays after the gang falls apart because there is nowhere else for him to go. He builds a little kingdom in New Austin and runs it with the kind of arbitrary violence that suggests he learned from Dutch's authority without absorbing Dutch's original reasons for that authority, which were at least nominally about something larger than his own gratification. The gang at its peak, at Horseshoe Overlook, in those first summer months of 1,899, is 23 people. 23 people who are thieves and killers and con artists and survivors of a dozen different kinds of hard circumstance, who have chosen each other with full knowledge of what that choice entails, who sit around the same campfire and eat the same food and sleep within earshot of each other and wake up and do it again. That is the community. That is the thing being lost as the game progresses. Not the money and not the freedom in the abstract, but that specific sound of 23 people alive together on a summer night, the firelight and the voices, the argument about cards in one corner, and the quiet conversation about something personal in another, and the music when Javier plays, and the stories Dutch tells that people want to hear. That is what cannot be recreated. Whatever is coming for these people, whether it is a farm in West Elizabeth, or a bounty hunting career, or the edge of a cliff in the tall trees, none of them will have that again. It existed, and it was real, and it was good, even though it was built on theft and maintained through violence. That complication is real too. Both things are real at the same time, and the game does not let you look away from either one of them. The boy is 12 years old, and his name is John Marston. Dutch intercedes, because Dutch at this point in his life genuinely does intervene when he sees the strong preying on the weak, and because a 12-year-old boy about to be hanged for stealing is exactly the kind of injustice that Dutch's philosophy was built to oppose. John is taken in. 2 years later, Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur pull off a bank robbery that nets them $5,000. They stay in town long enough to hand some of it out to the residents, playing at being folk heroes, Robin Hoods of the prairie. It works, in its way. People talk about them in tones that have respect in them, maybe some admiration. The story of the gang gets bigger, gets passed around, acquires the quality of legend, while the people in it are still alive to hear it. The gang keeps growing. Bill Williamson joins in 1893, a man with a violent streak and a desperate need to belong somewhere that will tolerate him, which the gang does, mostly. Javier Escuela arrives in 1895, a Mexican outlaw with a real talent for horsemanship and a personal history that the gang never fully knows, but can sense in how he moves through the world. Lenny Summers is young and smart and quick with a gun. Tilly Jackson comes from hard circumstances and has survived things that would have broken people with fewer resources. Mary Beth Gaskill is a pickpocket with a secret love of romance novels and a gentleness that survives the roughness of the life around her. Sean McGuire is Irish and loud and braver than he has any right to be, given how reckless he is. Charles Smith, whose mother was Grizzlies Cree and whose father was black, carries himself with a quiet dignity that makes him one of the most respected people in the camp, despite being one of the newest arrivals. And then there is Hosea Matthews, always Hosea, growing older and slightly creakier, but no less sharp, no less warm, no less the one who can talk Dutch down when Dutch is getting too far ahead of himself, the conscience of a group that operates largely outside of other people's notions of conscience. They build something. It is messy and violent and sustained by theft, but it is also genuinely something. A community, a family in the full emotional weight of that word. Not just people living near each other, but people who would die for each other. People who pull their weight and look after the ones who cannot pull theirs right now. Dutch gives speeches at the campfire that people actually want to hear. Speeches that make the world sound like something that could be navigated and maybe even shaped. That make the life they are living sound like a choice rather than a trap. For a long time, it is both. It is hard and dangerous, and periodically someone dies who should not have died. But it is also free, or at least it feels free enough that the difference between the feeling and the reality has not yet become a problem. That problem is coming, though. It has been coming for years, and its name, when it finally arrives, is Blackwater. Section 3. The Lost Sons. Arthur, John, and the meaning of belonging. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs to orphans who were found before they knew how to want to be found. Arthur Morgan and John Marston both grew up without parents in any meaningful sense. Both were taken in by Dutch and Hosea when they were old enough to remember the before, which means they are old enough to understand what they were given, but also old enough to carry the weight of what they lost. That double awareness never entirely leaves them. You can see it in the way they move through the world, in the particular quality of their loyalty, which is fierce in a way that only makes sense if belonging is not something you take for granted. Arthur is the older of the two, the one who was there first, and the gap between them is significant enough that their relationship has always had a slightly older brother quality to it. Arthur taught John things. Not the way Dutch taught Arthur, not the grand philosophy and the speeches about freedom, but the practical things, the everyday survival things. How to read trail sign. How to stay on a horse when the horse does not want you there. When to push a situation and when to walk away from it. John was difficult. He was closed off in ways that Arthur was not quite closed off, carrying something darker and more defended. But Arthur saw enough of himself in John to persist, to keep showing up even when John made it hard, which John made it hard quite regularly. Arthur Morgan was born around 1863, and by the time you meet him in the game, he is 36 years old and has been an outlaw his entire adult life. He has a face that has been hit a lot and weathered a lot, the kind of face that looks like it was made out of an old boot in the best possible way. He moves with the particular deliberateness of someone very large who has learned to be careful about how much space he takes up, because he has seen what happens when he stops being careful. He writes in a journal. That is the detail that surprises people the first time, that this big violent man writes in a journal, sketching the landscapes he rides through, jotting observations about the people he meets, recording his thoughts about what is happening around him with a frankness and a lack of self-pity that is quietly extraordinary. The journal is Arthur's inner life made visible, and his inner life is more complicated than what he shows the world. He is capable of tremendous violence, and he knows it, and that knowledge sits with him in ways he does not often discuss. He believes in Dutch, deeply, in the specific way that someone believes in the person who gave their life shape and purpose when it had neither. That belief is not blind, exactly, but it is strong enough that he bends it toward Dutch, even when the evidence for bending is not quite there. Even when something in him is starting to say that the story Dutch tells about the world is not quite matching up with what he can see in front of his eyes. He had a son, once. He does not talk about this, but it is in the journal. A woman named Eliza. The son's name was Isaac. Dutch gave Arthur money to set them up, and Arthur visited when he could, which was not often enough, which is the kind of understatement that a person uses when the actual truth is too painful to say plainly. They were killed. Robbed and killed by people whose names Arthur never learned, for a small amount of money that nobody would have missed. Isaac was 14. Arthur writes about this in the journal with a flatness that is the sound of someone who has processed a grief to the place where it has calcified, where it is no longer raw, but is just a weight that has been carried so long it has become structural. He had a woman he loved, too, Mary Linton, before she became Mary Linton, when she was still Mary Gillis and Arthur was still young enough to imagine a different kind of life. Her family disapproved, and she chose her family, and Arthur let her, because Arthur's version of love does not include making someone's choices for them. They see each other again in the game years later, and there is something still there, something mutual and unresolved, but by then the circumstances have closed around both of them in ways that make the other version of the story impossible. It has been impossible for a long time. Arthur knows this. He also cannot quite stop feeling it. John Marston's story is different in the texture of its sadness. John was born in 1873 to a Scottish immigrant father who died when John was about 8, leaving him to a brief, unhappy stint in an orphanage before he ran away and found his way into the kind of trouble that is also sometimes the only alternative to worse trouble. Dutch's gang rescued him from a hanging at 12 years old. From that point forward, the gang is the only family John has ever known. John is complicated in ways that are not always immediately sympathetic. He spent years not being sure that his son Jack was actually his son. He avoided his responsibilities toward Abigail and Jack in ways that Arthur called him out on with some consistency, because Arthur takes the idea of family seriously in a way that John, ironically, struggles with, even as he insists the gang is his family. John is not a bad person. He is a person who does not know how to be close without pulling away, who has never seen modeled for him what it looks like to stay, who was abandoned so early that he developed a reflexive version of abandoning first, as a kind of protection. Abigail Roberts has been with the gang almost as long as John has, though her story before the gang is deliberately left a little vague. She was a prostitute who came under the gang's protection, and then their roof, and then specifically John's orbit. And she has loved John with a patience and a frustration that go together like weather. She knows exactly what he is and exactly what he is not, and she loves him anyway, which is the kind of love that is not naive, but is something better than naive. She is also, notably, one of the toughest people in the camp, a fact that the game makes clear in the quiet ways it shows her refusing to be reduced. Jack Marston is a child in Red Dead Redemption 2, young enough that the world has not yet crushed the openness out of him. He loves books. He asks questions. He follows Arthur around with something close to worship, treating him like an uncle, because in every sense that matters, Arthur is an uncle, is family, is one of the most consistent presences in Jack's life. Arthur reads to Jack. He takes him fishing, once, in one of the quieter and more beautiful moments the game offers. Jack tells Arthur he wants to be a writer. Arthur takes this seriously, in a way that suggests he wishes someone had taken it seriously for him when he was that age. The camp is not just these central people, of course. It is full of others, each with their own weight and texture. Pearson, the cook, who was a naval man once, and carries that history in the way he organizes things, in his pride about what he can make from whatever the gang brings in. Uncle, whose actual name nobody knows, and who is mostly famous for his spectacular capacity to avoid work while maintaining a genuine and irritating affection for everyone, who is sicker than he lets on and older than most outlaws get to be, which means he has survived something, even if what he survived was mostly his own laziness. Karen Jones, a pickpocket with a drinking problem that gets worse as the game progresses, who has a sharpness and a humor that sits alongside a pain she will not show to anyone she trusts, which is to say, almost no one. Reverend Swanson, who was a preacher, and then the drink got him, and is now both, simultaneously, a man of God and a man with a significant daily dependency on liquor, who has moments of genuine clarity that hit harder because they are surrounded by so much fog. These people, these specific people with their specific habits and their specific faces, this is what the Vanderlinde gang is, at its heart, not a criminal enterprise, though it is that too. A collection of people who did not fit anywhere else and found, in each other, somewhere that would take them. Arthur Morgan believes in this more than he believes in almost anything. He believes in it enough that, even when he starts to understand what Dutch is becoming, even when the evidence accumulates that the thing they built is breaking, he holds on. He holds on and holds on, until holding on is no longer possible. What broke it started in Blackwater, before the game begins, in the smoke and blood of a ferry heist that was supposed to be the one that set them free, and instead became the thing they ran from for the rest of their days. Section 4. The Shadow Before the Storm. Blackwater and what came before. The Blackwater Massacre is the wound that the game is set inside. You never see it happen directly. It exists in whispers, in the way people flinch when it comes up, in the guilt that sits on certain characters, like a stain that has gotten into the fabric. It is always there, referenced and felt and circled around, the event that everything else is a consequence of. Learning what happened in Blackwater, piecing it together from fragments across the whole of the game, is one of the most deliberate narrative choices Rockstar made, and it is a good one. The mystery of it gives everything else an undertow. Here is what the game eventually confirms, and what the evidence strongly suggests about what the game leaves officially unclear. In May 1899, Dutch van der Linde leads his gang on a ferry robbery in Blackwater, the largest and most ambitious thing they have attempted. The ferry carries a significant amount of money, enough that Dutch describes it as the one that sets them all free, the score that funds the journey to some place they cannot be touched. This is not the first time Dutch has described a job in those terms. It will not be the last. But this one has a specific quality of finality to it, a sense that this is the plan, the real plan, the one that resolves everything. Micah Bell has recently joined the gang. That timing matters. Micah joined in late 1898, just months before the Blackwater heist, after apparently saving Dutch's life when a deal went sideways. This is Micah's version of the story, and Dutch accepted it. And once Dutch trusts you, he trusts you with a completeness that becomes its own kind of vulnerability. Micah had no history with the gang before that. He came from a family of violent men, his father, a killer, his childhood, an education in cruelty and survival in its most stripped-down form. He learned early that other people are resources to be used or obstacles to be removed, that there is no third category. He is charismatic in a grating, challenging way, the kind of person who tests boundaries constantly to see which ones hold. Something goes wrong at Blackwater. The Pinkerton agents are waiting. There are far more of them than there should be, more than could have gotten there on the basis of routine intelligence. The details of what happens in the chaos are things the gang speaks about only obliquely, because the full accounting is too painful. Jenny Kirk is killed. Davy Callender is shot, and later dies of his wounds. Mac Callender gets separated from the others in the confusion and is never seen again. Dutch shoots a woman named Heidi McCourt during the event, an innocent person. And this shooting haunts him and haunts what people remember about him. The gang flees without the money, without their dead, without any of the things the heist was supposed to deliver. A prominent theory among players, one supported by the evidence the game drops throughout its story, is that the Pinkerton presence at Blackwater was not random. Agent Milton, late in the game, reveals that Micah has been feeding information to the Pinkertons since his return from Guarma. But the possibility that Micah's collaboration began earlier, possibly at the very inception of the Blackwater job, is hard to dismiss. There is a wanted poster for Dutch at Micah's old campsite in Strawberry, which suggests the Pinkertons were tracking the gang before the massacre. Micah's suggestion of the heist in the first place, the extraordinary police presence that greeted them there, the way the whole thing went wrong so completely and so quickly. Whether Micah sold them out at Blackwater or only began formally cooperating later, he is the rod at the center of everything that follows. He is the reason the gang is running. He is the reason they are cold and scared in the mountains at the start of the game. He is the reason their moral math will keep coming up wrong in the months that follow. The reason Dutch's paranoia will find enough food to grow into something that consumes him. But before we live in the ruins of what Blackwater made, there is one more story to tell about the time before, about the world Dutch was navigating before the ferry and the blood and the snow. Dutch had a love before all of this, a woman named Annabelle, about whom the game says less than you want it to. What it does say is that Colm O'Driscoll had her killed. Colm O'Driscoll leads a rival gang, has led it for years, and between Dutch's crew and the O'Driscolls, there is a hatred that has moved past personal and become institutional. The O'Driscolls are not a particularly principled organization. They are violent in the gratuitous way rather than the defensive way. Dutch's grudge against Colm is old and it is bottomless, and it is one of the few places where Dutch's famous emotional control completely disappears. Annabelle's death sits in Dutch as evidence. Evidence that the world outside the gang is dangerous in a way that is not abstract, that the enemies are real, and that safety, real safety, requires power. When Dutch gets more ruthless over the years, when the pragmatism in him starts edging out the idealism, Annabelle is somewhere in the background of that. Not as an excuse, exactly, but as context. A man who loses someone to violence in a world that provides no institutional redress learns things from that loss, not always the right things. The gang had good years. They genuinely did. Years when Dutch's vision was holding together, and the philosophy was feeding people, and the community they had built felt like something worth defending. But by 1899, by the time the ferry job is conceived, the pressure has been building for a long time. The law has been tightening. The territories where you could move freely are smaller than they were a decade ago. Dutch has been saying for years that they need one big score, and then they can leave. And each time the big score does not quite come through, he says it again with the same conviction, and a few more people around him start to wonder silently whether the big score is ever actually going to come. The Blackwater Massacre does not just scatter the gang physically. It cracks something in Dutch that was already under pressure. It makes him start looking for traitors among his own people, because the alternative to a traitor is that the plan was wrong, and Dutch cannot carry that possibility. It makes him more desperate, and desperation in a man with Dutch's rhetorical gifts and Dutch's capacity to bend other people to his will is genuinely dangerous. They run into the mountains, into the snow, into the opening of the game, trying to survive, trying to regroup, trying to find a way back to something that is already, though none of them can quite see it yet, irretrievably gone. Section 5. Snow and Survival. Coulter and the First Chapter. The mountains do not care. That is the first thing you understand in the Grizzlies, in the opening hours of the game. The snow falls without malice and without mercy, and it does not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent, between the scared and the brave. It buries everything equally. The gang stumbles into the abandoned mining town of Coulter, a place that looks like the bones of something that already gave up, half buried in drifts, the buildings groaning under the weight of accumulated ice. This is where they will wait for the storm to pass, or try to. Dutch is trying to hold everything together by sheer force of personality, which is the only tool he has, and also, at this point, the thing he is best at. He gives the speech, the kind that the gang has heard before in harder moments, about how they are going to get through this, about how they have survived worse, about how the family sticks together, and the family is stronger than what the world throws at them. People listen. They want to believe it. Dutch at his best, Dutch before the cracks become fractures, is extraordinarily compelling. He has a warmth that is not fake, exactly, even if it is also strategic. He genuinely loves these people, or believes he does, which for most practical purposes amounts to the same thing. But Davy Callender is dying of his wound, and Jenny Kirk is already dead. And somewhere on a mountain behind them, John Marston went looking for shelter and has not come back. The gang is 23 people roughly, and they are short on food and short on warmth and long on fear, and 2 of their number are either dead or somewhere out in the white. Arthur goes to find John. This is not a conversation or a decision, exactly. It is just what Arthur does. He goes out into the storm because John is out there, and Arthur does not leave people he loves in the cold when he can prevent it. He finds John barely alive on a ridgeline, nearly hypothermic, and brings him back. John is difficult about being saved, as John usually is, but he comes. Micah, meanwhile, has done some scouting and found a farmhouse. People are there, he tells Dutch. Supplies are there, and they need both. What he does not mention, or possibly does not know, is that the farmhouse is O'Driscoll territory. When Dutch and Arthur and Micah go to investigate, the situation becomes violent almost immediately, as situations involving O'Driscolls and Dutch Vanderlinde tend to do. They deal with it. In the O'Driscoll camp, they find something useful, intelligence about a train owned by Leviticus Cornwall, carrying a significant payload, traveling a route that could be intercepted. Dutch decides to rob it. This is the gang's first major move in the game, the first attempt to turn survival into forward motion, and it sets the tone for everything that follows. The constant tension between playing it safe and taking the risks that might actually change their situation. They also find, at the farmhouse, a woman locked in the cellar. Her name is Sadie Adler. Her husband Jake has been murdered by the O'Driscolls. She has been hiding in the basement for God knows how long, listening to the men who killed her husband moving around above her. When Micah finds her and mistakes her for one of the O'Driscolls, it is Arthur who de-escalates, who recognizes a terrified woman rather than a threat. They take her with them. She does not speak much, at first, She is somewhere past fear, in the place grief takes you when fear has burned itself out. The Coulter chapter is short, but it does what a first chapter needs to do. It establishes the shape of the family, and the shape of the whole in it. It shows you what Arthur is, what Dutch is, what the relationship between them looks like when it is still mostly functional. It gives you John barely surviving, and Hosea being warm and pragmatic, and Charles being quietly competent, and Micah being sharp-edged and off-putting in ways that the game does not over-signal, because it is saving that later. And it gives you the snow, the world-indifferent snow, as the first image, because everything that follows in this story is about cold. About the cold that comes from the outside, from the weather and the law and the closing frontier, and the cold that grows from the inside, slowly, as the thing Dutch built starts to hollow out from within. When the snow melts enough to travel, they move. Down from the mountains and into the heartland, into New Hanover, into the beginning of the middle of the story, where the game opens up and the world becomes enormous around you. The gang sets up camp at Horseshoe Overlook, and for a little while it feels like it might be all right. They have space, they have the river, the weather is better. Hosea gives Arthur a horse, and the two of them go hunting together in Amberino, looking for a legendary bear, nearly getting killed, laughing about it afterward. These moments exist. They are real. The warmth of them is not a lie. But Blackwater is still there. The Pinkertons are already moving, and somewhere in the machinery of the gang, something has already started to go wrong, in ways that are mostly invisible from the inside. Section 6. The Many Faces of Betrayal. Micah Bell. Micah Bell was born into violence the way some people are born into poverty, which is to say it shaped him before he had any say in what he was being shaped into. His father, Micah Bell Sr., was a killer, not an outlaw in the romanticized sense, not someone with a philosophy or a code, just a violent man who passed his violence down like a genetic inheritance. What Micah's childhood looked like in concrete detail, the game does not show you, but you can read the outline in what Micah became. A person who does not believe other people are real in the way he is real. A person who experiences empathy as a weakness in others, to be exploited rather than a capacity to be exercised. A person who measures every relationship in terms of what it produces for him and discards it the moment that calculation changes. He is not stupid. That is important to understand. Micah Bell is genuinely intelligent, genuinely observant, genuinely skilled. He is fast with a gun, faster than almost anyone in the gang, which in 1899 is a meaningful form of currency. He can read people, read the room, read a situation, and identify the leverage points within it. He uses this intelligence exclusively in service of himself. That is what makes him dangerous rather than merely unpleasant. He joined the gang in late 1898 after the incident where he claimed to have saved Dutch's life. The details of what happened are from Micah's account, which means they should be regarded with appropriate skepticism. What is clear is that Dutch believed it, and Dutch's belief in Micah was not just trust, but something more intense, a kind of excitement about having found someone new. By 1898, the gang had been together for decades. The family had solidified. Dutch knew everyone, and everyone knew Dutch, and there is a way in which that familiarity can start to feel constraining, even for the person who built it. Micah was new. Micah was dangerous in a way that Dutch found interesting. Micah had no history with Arthur or John, no old loyalties that would compete with loyalty to Dutch. From almost the first moment, the existing members of the gang find Micah difficult. Arthur dislikes him with a frankness that he extends to almost nobody, a bone-deep, instinctive resistance. Hosea watches him with the particular wariness of someone who has made his living reading people and does not like what he is reading. Lenny and Sean and most of the others give him a wide berth. The women in the camp, Sadie and Mary Beth and Karen, find him aggressive and contemptuous in ways they have no patience for. Even Bill Williamson, who is not exactly the gang's moral compass, is uneasy around Micah. Dutch sees none of this, or sees it and dismisses it. This is the beginning of the rift that Micah will spend the rest of the game widening, deepening, exploiting. The rift between Dutch's relationship with Arthur, the old son, the foundational relationship, and Dutch's new fascination with Micah. Every time Arthur expresses concern about a plan or doubts a decision, Micah is there to frame that doubt as disloyalty. Every time Dutch needs to believe in himself, Micah is there with the validation. It is a classic pattern, and it works because Dutch, for all his intelligence, has a vanity at his center that is both his greatest power and the thing that will eventually destroy him. The strawberry incident early in the game tells you what Micah is in miniature. He has been arrested, and Dutch asks Arthur to go get him out. The job involves shooting up half the town of Strawberry because Micah wants his guns back, specifically, not just to escape, but to leave with the weapons that are his and not leave them in law enforcement's possession. People die in that extraction who did not need to die. Micah is cheerful about it afterward. Not cheerful in the gallows humor way that a lot of the gang is cheerful about violence, the way you develop a certain distance from it after long enough, but genuinely, lightly cheerful, the way you are cheerful about something that did not cost you anything. After the disaster of the St. Denis bank job, after the gang splinters and some of them end up on a burning ship headed for who knows where, Micah gets captured by the Pinkertons. This is the moment that Agent Milton later reveals as the start of his formal cooperation with them. Though the circumstantial case that he was their instrument, even earlier, is strong. He is offered a deal. His freedom in exchange for information. Micah takes the deal without visible anguish. What he feeds them after that is steady and specific. He tells them about the camp at Lacaille. He tells them when the gang will be vulnerable, when Dutch is making decisions that can be interrupted. He moves through the camp using Dutch's trust as armor, and he uses that time to deepen his influence over Dutch, to position himself as the indispensable confidant, the one who is most faithful, the one Arthur and John are disloyal in comparison to. The thing that is genuinely unsettling about Micah is not that he does all of this. The terrible acts are almost easier to look at directly because they are clear. What is harder is the way he understands people. He understands that Dutch needs to believe. He understands that after years of leading, of being the one everyone else depends on, Dutch has developed a profound sensitivity to any suggestion that his vision might be wrong, his judgment might be failing, his age might be catching him. Micah finds this sensitivity and presses on it, consistently, with surgical precision. He makes Dutch feel understood. He makes Dutch feel like the best version of himself, which is the most dangerous thing you can do to someone who needs that feeling more than they need almost anything else. By the time Arthur confronts Dutch with what he knows about Micah, Dutch has been so thoroughly prepared for this moment that he cannot hear it. He has been told, probably hundreds of times in subtle ways, that Arthur has been growing away from the gang, that Arthur's illness has made him pessimistic, that Arthur and John both want to leave, and that wanting to leave means they were never really family. By the time the direct accusation lands, it sounds to Dutch like one more piece of evidence for the thing Micah has been arguing all along. Susan Grimshaw dies because of Micah. Hosea dies, indirectly, because of Micah. Half the catastrophes that the gang stumbles through in the second half of the game are either caused or amplified by the steady drip of information leaving the camp and going to the Pinkertons. He is not the main villain in the way of a cartoonish antagonist. He does not monologue. He does not explain himself. He just pursues his interest with a consistency and a coldness that makes him more frightening than any of those things. He is what happens when a person decides that other people exist for their use, and then acquires enough skill to act on that decision without being stopped. His death, when it comes, in the snow on Mount Hagen in the epilogue, is not cathartic in the way that satisfying villain deaths sometimes are. It is just the end of something that should have ended much sooner. John pulls the trigger. Dutch, who came to the confrontation and stood between Micah and his escape, does not stop it. That is the closest thing to acknowledgement that Dutch ever offers, that he stood there and watched and did not intervene. It is not an apology. Dutch does not do apologies, but it is something. Section 7. The Weight of a Dying World, Arthur's Tuberculosis, and the Road to Redemption. There is a mission called Money Lending and Other Sins, which is not a glamorous title, and it is not a glamorous mission. Arthur goes out to collect debts on behalf of Leopold Strauss, the gang's bookkeeper, the man who has made a practice of lending small amounts of money to people who cannot afford to repay them, and then sending Arthur to persuade them to repay. It is one of the ugliest jobs in the gang's repertoire, uglier even than outright robbery, because it is dressed up in the language of legitimate transaction. One of the people Arthur goes to collect from is a man named Thomas Downs. Downs is sick. He is visibly, Obviously, unmistakably sick, the kind of sick that a person who has spent any time around illness would recognize immediately. He is coughing. He does not have the money. Arthur grabs him, shakes him, gets closer than he should, to a man with a respiratory illness, in a world where nobody has a very sophisticated understanding of how respiratory illness travels. And he beats him badly enough that Downs collapses. The bacteria are airborne. They travel in the small droplets that Downs produces when he coughs. Arthur does not know this. Nobody in 1899 fully knows this, at least not in a way that translates into practical precaution for someone trying to intimidate a debt. By the time Strauss gives Arthur this job, the infection is already done. It just has not declared itself yet. Tuberculosis works slowly. That is its particular horror in the context of Arthur's story. It does not kill you immediately or even quickly. It installs itself in your lungs, and then it makes itself comfortable. And then it begins, over months, to take you apart. You lose weight. You develop a cough that starts as an irritant and progresses to something worse. You have fevers. You become tired in a way that sleep does not fix. The disease is called consumption in the era because of what it seems to do. It consumes you from inside, taking your strength and your color and your solidity until you are a thinner, paler, quieter version of what you were. Arthur starts coughing somewhere in the middle of the game. The player might not notice it at first because coughing is not unusual in a world full of dust and cold and people who smoke. But it continues, and it gets worse. And in a mission called A Fork in the Road, Arthur is in Saint Denis when he suddenly cannot stay upright. He collapses. A stranger drags him to a doctor. Dr. Joseph Barnes examines him and delivers the diagnosis with the particular combination of professional neutrality and genuine regret that doctors in that era could manage, which was not much in the way of comfort because there was not much in the way of treatment. Tuberculosis in 1899 was a death sentence delivered in stages. He could inject Arthur with morphine. He could tell him the disease would progress. He could not cure it. There was nothing to be done. Arthur rides back to camp after this diagnosis, and the game lets you do it slowly, on horseback, watching the landscape. It is a deliberate choice. The world looks the same as it did before the doctor's office. The grass is still the same color. The light is still the same quality. The mountains are still there, and the river is still there, and the same birds are still doing the same things. Nothing has changed, and Arthur is a different person. The Arthur Morgan of the first half of the game is not entirely unsympathetic, but he is harder to love than the Arthur of the second half. He does things he knows are wrong without much visible internal struggle. He collects debts. He enforces Dutch's decisions even when those decisions are questionable. He is loyal in a way that has not yet been tested against his own conscience in any serious way. He is good at violence, and he uses that skill in service of a structure that he has chosen not to examine too closely. The diagnosis changes his relationship with examination. When you know you are going to die, and you know it with the specific timed quality that a disease diagnosis provides, the question of how to use the time that remains stops being abstract. It becomes very concrete. And Arthur, being Arthur, does not become a saint overnight. He does not stop doing bad things immediately. But he starts seeing them more clearly. He starts tracking the cost to other people, the cost to himself, in a way he was not tracking before. He starts distinguishing between the things he does because he genuinely believes they are right, and the things he does because it is easier than fighting about them. The Downs family is one of the threads he pulls. He finds Edith Downs, Thomas's widow, who, if he has high honor levels, tells him in no uncertain terms that he killed her husband, that Arthur's hands and the debt collection and the violence are why she is where she is. This moment lands differently after the diagnosis, because Arthur knows now that the victim gave him something in return, not intentionally, not as punishment, but as consequence. The world is full of consequences that we do not see until they are already inside us. He helps the Downs family. He helps a lot of people in the second half of the game in ways that have no advantage for him, that are purely because he can see that the help is needed. He helps a man escape debt bondage. He helps Rainsfall and the Wapiti people when Dutch has already decided to use them as pawns. He steers people away from trouble he could easily have walked away from. He does these things not with the grandiosity of someone performing virtue, but with the quiet, practical manner of someone who has decided to do what he can with what he has left, He tells John to leave. This is perhaps the most important thing Arthur does, and it is not dramatic in the way of a movie moment. It is a series of conversations, a consistency of insistence, that John should take his family and go. The gang is done. The thing Dutch built is over, even if Dutch cannot see it. John has a wife and a son and a life ahead of him if he takes it, and Arthur, who will not have that life, is determined that someone should. The elk, the eagle. The nature that Arthur draws in his journal with a precision and a care that suggests he has been looking at it for a long time without letting himself really see it. In the final weeks of his life, Arthur looks at the world he is leaving with the attention that dying can force open in a person. The bison on the plains, the deer in the tree line at dusk, the way a river catches the light in the hour before dark. He sketches all of it. He notes all of it. He leaves it in the journal as evidence that he was here, that he paid attention, that he found it beautiful, even as it moved away from him. He dies on a mountainside, watching the sunrise, either beaten to death by Micah if his honor is low, or left to die of the illness by himself if it is high. The sunrise is the same either way. The game does not make the peaceful death more beautiful than the violent one, really. Both versions of Arthur die with the light coming up, with the chest that has been hurting for months finally still. Both versions say in their last few minutes that John made it. He is the only one. But I tried. In the end, I did. The redemption in the arc is not a transformation from bad person to good person. It is something more real than that. It is a person deciding, late in his life, to close the gap between what he actually believed and how he actually lived. It is a person figuring out, under the pressure of dying, who he was when all the other things fell away, and finding that what was left, while not perfect, was worth something. Section 8. The people left behind: Sadie, Charles, and the heart of Hosea Matthews. Every story has its people at the center, and every story has the people who are not quite at the center, but without whom the center would not hold. Hosea Matthews is 60-something years old at the start of Red Dead Redemption 2. He is the oldest person in the gang, most likely, and he carries that age with a grace that comes from having made a genuine peace with the kind of person he is. He is a con man, a liar by profession, a thief by practice, and he is also one of the most genuinely decent people you will meet in the game. These things coexist in him without apparent difficulty, because Hosea long ago stopped requiring his ethics to be consistent. He lies to Marks, and he does not lie to family. He is warm with people he loves, and he has no warmth to spare for people who threaten them. He was briefly married to a woman named Bessie, who died before the events of the game. He does not talk about Bessie often. When he does, there is a texture in his voice that is the sound of something that has been handled so many times, it has become smooth, worn down to something that hurts less, but will never stop hurting entirely. He and Bessie lived for a time in the Grizzlies, East, a period when he and Dutch were briefly outside the life, trying to be regular people. It did not last. It never lasts, but he remembers it. He tells Arthur at some point that he thinks about his life, and he is not sure he would have done anything differently, which is either contentment or something a person tells themselves when the alternatives are not available. Maybe both. Hosea is the kind of person who is honest enough to know the difference, but wise enough not to insist on it. When Agent Milton shoots Hosea outside the St. Denis Bank, it is one of the cleanest gut punches the game delivers. Not because it is unexpected, exactly, because the game has been building toward catastrophe for chapters, but because Hosea is the one person in the gang who everyone, including the player, had been unconsciously trusting to make it out. He is the one Dutch actually listens to. He is the one who provides the check on Dutch's excesses. He is the argument against the worst of Dutch's decisions, made flesh, standing right there in camp. And when he is gone, the argument is gone with him, and Dutch accelerates into the version of himself that nobody can pull back from. Charles Smith arrived at the gang not long before the events of the game, and his reception was not universally warm, which says something about who some of the gang members were that is not flattering. He is a man of mixed heritage, his mother Grizzlies Cree and his father Black, and he carries himself with a quietness that is not passivity, but something more like the deep calm of a person who has long since stopped requiring other people's approval to know his own worth. He is an extraordinary hunter, possibly the best in the gang, He has an empathy for animals and for people that he does not perform. He simply has it, consistently, without making speeches about it. Charles is one of the few members of the gang who never needs to be excused for anything. He does not have a drinking problem, or a gambling problem, or a cruelty he is working through. He is just good, in a way that is not boring, because the goodness is not naive. He knows what the gang is. He knows what Arthur is. He helps people, because helping people is what he does, because he has decided that is how he wants to move through whatever time he has. When the gang falls apart, Charles stays to help the Wapiti people travel north, through Wyoming, through the losses the journey cost them. He shows up for John in the epilogue without being asked. He does what he can, steadily, without drama. Sadie Adler's story begins in that basement in Coulter, hiding from the men who killed her husband, and it moves in a direction that nobody could have predicted. When she was brought back to camp, wrapped in a blanket and barely speaking, she was married to Jake Adler for 3 years before the O'Driscoll boys came to the farmhouse. She and Jake had built their life from scratch on a ranch in Ambarino, doing the work together. The physical labor divided equally between them, the kind of partnership that is not just affection, but the daily decision to keep choosing each other. When the O'Driscolls came, they killed Jake. They held Sadie in the cellar. She survived the way some people survive terrible things, by going very still and waiting, by not letting what was happening break all the way through to the part of her that needed to keep functioning. The camp is not sure what to do with her at first. She does not fit a defined role. She cannot just do the cooking forever. She is not built for the peripheral domestic work. She keeps looking at the situation and finding it insufficient and wanting to do something. She starts helping with camp work, then with more active things. She learns. She watches Arthur, and she watches Charles, and she asks questions without embarrassment. She is a fast learner because she is motivated not just by curiosity, but by grief converted into purpose, the particular energy of someone who has decided that the only tolerable way to be alive in the world is to make herself dangerous to the people who made Jake's existence ending so ordinary to them. She becomes one of the most capable people in the gang, not in spite of her wildness, but partly because of it, because she has the willingness to go further than people who have more to lose. She breaks John out of Sisika Penitentiary. She rescues Abigail from the Pinkertons. She is at Beaver Hollow when the gang collapses, and she takes a knife in the gut during the fight, which only slows her down for the length of time it takes to be angry about it. In the epilogue, she is a bounty hunter. She has found a way to channel what the grief made of her into something that functions in the world, that gives her purpose and forward motion. She is one of the few people who comes through the story and out the other side into something that looks like a life. The people who come through, Sadie and Charles and John and Abigail and Jack, they are all people who were able to hold on to something that Dutch lost. Not innocence, they are none of them innocent, but something like groundedness, the ability to know what matters and hold it. The understanding that the family is not the gang as an institution, but the specific people in it, the ones you would grieve if they were gone, and that when the institution starts requiring the sacrifice of the people, the institution is the thing that has to go. Section 9. A nation swallowing its own. The Wapiti Indians. The Wapiti Reservation sits in the northeastern part of Ambarino, in the shadow of the Grizzlies, on land that nobody in power particularly wants right up until the moment someone discovers it might be useful, at which point they want it enormously, and the people already living on it become an inconvenience to be managed. Before 1899, before the events of the game, the Wapiti people had already been moved multiple times. Peace treaties had been signed, 2 of the 3 of them, and those 2 had been broken by the government that signed them, which is a pattern so consistent across the history of that era that calling it a pattern understates how systematic it was. By the time the game takes place, the Wapiti are on the reservation trying to make a life on land that is considered suitable for them precisely because nobody else has wanted it. That assessment is in the process of changing. Leviticus Cornwall's oil interests have identified the reservation land as potentially rich in petroleum. This is not confirmed publicly, but the government is already in conversation with Cornwall's organization about access. Colonel Favors, who commands the military presence in the region, has his orders, and his orders are to manage the Wapiti in whatever way is necessary to protect the government's eventual plans for the land. He is a man who does not need to be told what his orders actually mean. He understands the subtext. Rain's Fall is the chief of the Wapiti. He is old enough to have witnessed everything that happened to his people with the full consciousness of an adult, which means he has been watching the systematic destruction of his world for decades with the particular kind of sadness that comes from understanding exactly what is being destroyed and being unable to stop it. He has chosen the diplomatic path not because he is naive about whether diplomacy will work. He is not naive. He has very few illusions left, but because he has seen the alternative, and the alternative costs lives that he does not have to spend. He had 3 sons. His eldest was killed by the army. His second son's mother was also killed by the army before the events of the game. That son is Eagle Flies. His third son does not appear in the game. What the army took from Rain's Fall is not abstract. It is 2 people he loved whose faces he carries with him every day, and a surviving son who is carrying the rage that Rain's Fall has been trying to transform into something survivable. Eagle Flies is young, and he is angry, and he is right about everything except what to do about it, which is where the tragedy lies. His mother was murdered. His older brother was murdered. His people have been moved off their land, moved again, promised protection by a government that breaks its promises with the consistency of weather. He looks at his father's diplomacy, and he sees what it has produced, which is not security and not justice and not the land back, and he concludes that diplomacy has produced nothing because diplomacy was never going to produce anything, because the government does not need to give the Wapiti anything as long as the Wapiti will accept not getting it. He is not entirely wrong. The tragedy of Eagle Flies is that his analysis of the situation is mostly correct, but the available responses are all bad. Fight and lose. Accept and lose. The only difference is what you preserve in the losing, and Eagle Flies is young enough and angry enough to not yet know, fully know in his bones, that preserving lives is worth more than preserving pride. Rain's Fall knows this. He has paid for this knowledge with everything he has paid for it with. Dutch sees Eagle Flies and sees a tool. This is one of the most important things the game shows you about who Dutch is becoming in 1899. He approaches the Wapiti with the language of solidarity, with the rhetoric of shared victimhood, which is not entirely dishonest, because Dutch does genuinely believe that corporations and government are oppressors, that the powerful use the law to exploit the weak. But he is not helping the Wapiti because he wants to help the Wapiti. He is helping them because he sees that their anger can be directed at the army in ways that create distractions for his gang, that draw the military's attention away from his operations. He tells Eagle Flies that the answer is resistance. He tells Eagle Flies that violence is the only language power understands. He takes the young man's legitimate fury and gives it a shape that serves Dutch's purposes. Arthur sees this. In the later chapters, after the diagnosis, after he has started tracking the cost of things more carefully, Arthur watches Dutch with Eagle Flies, and he sees the manipulation clearly. He helps the Wapiti anyway, separately, genuinely, because the Wapiti are being treated unjustly regardless of what Dutch wants from them. He helps Captain Monroe, who is an army officer with an actual conscience about what his institution is doing. He rides with Rain's Fall and listens, really listens, to the older man's grief and his wisdom and his exhaustion. He rescues Eagle Flies from Fort Wallace and feels, doing it, the particular quality of a task that is right regardless of its outcome. The attack on the oil refinery is Eagle Flies' last action. He leads his warriors against Cornwall's operation, asking the gang to ride with them. Dutch agrees and then abandons the Wapiti once the distraction has served its purpose, leaving Eagle Flies exposed. Colonel Favors shoots Eagle Flies during the assault. Arthur and Charles bring him back to the reservation, carrying him on horseback, the young man bleeding out against Arthur's chest. He dies in his father's arms. Rain's Fall, who has lost so much already, holds his last surviving son, while the son's breathing slows. It is one of the quietest deaths in a game full of violent ones, and somehow that quietness makes it heavier. Eagle Flies had names in the world. He had a father who loved him. He had a people who needed him. He died because Dutch van der Linden needed a distraction, and Eagle Flies was young enough and angry enough to be useful. The Wapiti leave after that. They pack what they can carry, and they begin the journey north to Canada, which will cost them more lives as they travel through Wyoming. They bury eagle flies near the reservation before they go, because he belongs to that land in a way that could not be undone, even by everything the government did to deny it. Rain's fall goes with them, carrying another loss into an uncertain north. One more sorrow laid over all the others, one more name to remember. The story of the Wapiti is the story that Red Dead Redemption 2 tells alongside its main story, and it is inseparable from the main story's themes. The closing frontier does not close equally for everyone. The progress that is making Dutch's way of life untenable is the same force that has been making the Wapiti's way of life untenable for far longer, and with far more violence. Arthur sees this, in the end. He sees it, and it is one of the things that makes his last weeks feel different from the years before them, that he is moving through a world he is finally seeing clearly, and it is more beautiful and more terrible than he had let himself acknowledge. Section 10. The Fall of Dutch van der Linde. Dutch van der Linde was born, holding an idea about the world that was large enough to attract people to it, and not quite honest enough to sustain them. The idea was freedom. Real freedom. Not the kind that is defined by legal rights or civic participation, but the older, raw kind. The kind that means owing nothing to anyone and being answerable only to yourself. Dutch felt this idea deeply, genuinely, in a way that was not entirely self-serving, at least not at the beginning. He had read widely, he was educated in the self-taught, voracious way of people who came to education without formal instruction, and he had a framework that drew on the romantic individualism of the American frontier, the opposition to industrial capitalism, the conviction that what was being built in the name of progress was actually a cage, just one with better furniture than the cages they put poor people in. He was not wrong about everything. The railroads were built on exploitation. The corporations that owned the land and the resources and the apparatus of law enforcement did use that apparatus in service of their own interests. The Pinkertons were paid by men who wanted labor organized out of existence, and they did that work without visible moral concern. The system that Dutch opposed was genuinely an instrument of concentrated power, and it did genuinely grind people in the way Dutch said it. Ground people. But Dutch's diagnosis of the problem was clearer than his solutions, and his solutions got worse as the pressure increased. Robbing the rich and giving to the poor, which was the gang's early self-image, is the kind of thing that works as a story better than as a sustained practice, because it requires enough rich people passing through your territory to rob, and enough goodwill in the local communities to sustain you, and both of those things erode as the law closes in and as the gang's reputation becomes something people fear rather than something they warm to. The people around Dutch, who could most clearly see the gap between what he said and what he did, were Hosea and Arthur. Hosea because he had the age and the experience to recognize the patterns, because he had seen enough of how the world worked to know that grand visions usually come apart in specific ways, and that the specific way Dutch's vision was coming apart was that the dream was staying the same size, while the behavior required to sustain it was getting larger and more destructive. Arthur, because he loved Dutch and paid attention to the things he loved, which meant he could see the changes that Dutch himself could not see. What happens to Dutch in 1899 can be tracked through a few specific moments. The first is at the Cornwall confrontation in Annesburg. Dutch, Micah, and Arthur wait on the docks for Cornwall's yacht. Dutch has been saying for months that he is going to confront Cornwall, that he is going to send a message, that this is going to be a meaningful blow against the kind of power Cornwall represents. When it actually happens, Dutch kills Cornwall in what appears to be an unplanned, impulsive act, and then he seems surprised by Happy Dissonant. Arthur watches this and notes it. The man who made plans and stuck to them, who had reasons for everything, is starting to act on reflex and then construct the reasons afterward. The paranoia deepens. After Hosea and Lenny are killed in St. Denis, after the gang comes back from Guarma and finds everything worse than they left it, Dutch starts talking about a mole. Someone in the camp is working against them, feeding information to the enemy. He is not wrong, but the person he eventually cannot bring himself to name is Micah, the one who has been most consistently at his ear, the one who has been building the case for everyone else's disloyalty, while quietly being the most disloyal person in the room. His treatment of the Wapiti is the clearest evidence of the distance between who Dutch was and who he has become. Earlier, Dutch would not have used people who trusted him as cover for his own escape. Earlier, Dutch's stated commitment to the oppressed would have extended to actually helping the oppressed when he had the chance, instead of helping them in ways that conveniently served his other interests and abandoning them when the convenience ran out. In Beaver Hollow, the final camp, Dutch gives a speech about how they have always survived and they will survive this. People listen, but not the same way they listened before. The trust has been bleeding out for too long. Arthur stands and asks questions he never used to ask, in front of everyone, which is something that would once have been unthinkable. John is barely present and is clearly planning to leave. The women are frightened. The younger members are looking for any indication of what to do. When Arthur and John are finally driven out of camp, when Dutch sides with Micah and calls his two most loyal people traitors, something in Dutch's face suggests he knows what he is doing and cannot stop himself from doing it anyway. This is not a man who has been fooled into believing the wrong thing. This is a man who has chosen to believe the wrong thing, because believing the right thing would require him to look at himself honestly, and that look is more than he can stand. He disappears after Beaver Hollow. He does not go with Micah, does not collect the gold, does not do any of the things that the events were supposedly in service of. He just leaves. This is the most honest thing Dutch does in the entire game. This walking away from the consequence of his choices, this inability to sit with what he has made. He is not running to something. He is just running. In the epilogue, 8 years later, when John climbs Mount Hagen to find Micah and discovers Dutch there with him, it becomes clear that Dutch has been living with Micah's gang in the years since, using them, being used. When John and Dutch and Micah end up in the standoff at the top of the mountain, Dutch shoots Micah. Not because he has reformed, not because he has processed his grief and come to clarity. He shoots Micah because Micah is in front of him and holding money that does not matter. And in that moment, Dutch can see very clearly what Micah is, maybe for the first time, and what Dutch himself has been for a long time. And the only way to close the distance between the vision and the reality is to pull the trigger. He walks away after that too. He walks to the edge of the cliff, and he looks at John, and he says something about how there is another way, and then he falls. In Red Dead Redemption, 12 years later, John finds him in a fort, and Dutch walks off the edge of that cliff too, in what is clearly a choice rather than an accident. Dutch dies twice in this story, and both times by his own hand, and both times with a sense that he understood something in those final moments that he had been refusing to understand for years. He was not a simple villain. He was not a good man who became a villain. He was a person with genuine intelligence and genuine warmth and a genuine vision, who was also a narcissist who could not be wrong and who surrounded himself, eventually, with the people who would tell him he was right. And the compounding interest on that inability to be wrong was paid by everyone around him. Section 11. After the Fire. John, the epilogue, and everything that comes next. 8 years is a long time to carry something. John Marston in 1907 is 34 years old, and he is trying, with every available piece of himself, to be someone different from who he was. He has a wife and a son and a specific, achievable vision of what he wants, which is a ranch. Land, something that belongs to the family and cannot be taken by Dutch's changing moods or the Pinkertons' patience. Something you build with your hands, something that stays. The epilogue of Red Dead Redemption 2 is slower than what came before it, deliberately slower. After all the running and the violence and the moral weight of watching Arthur die, the game deposits you into a quieter rhythm. John works at Pronghorn Ranch in West Elizabeth under the name Jim Milton, getting up early, doing the work that needs doing, learning how to be around the Geddes family who employ him without the armor of outlaw identity to hide behind. He fixes fences. He breaks horses. He handles a situation with the Laramie gang that harasses the ranch, because John Marston handling a situation is one of the few things about his old life that translates cleanly. He is still not good at being present. That is a consistent thread through his life. The difficulty of staying when staying requires a kind of softness he was never taught. Abigail knows this. They are tender with each other in the epilogue in a way they were not in the main game, partly because they are both tired, and partly because enough has happened that the distance between them has cost something that neither of them wants to keep paying. Charles shows up. He helps John with the ranch, the physical work of building it. There are moments between them, quiet ones, that do not require a lot of words because the history is already there. Sadie shows up. She has become a bounty hunter, and she moves through the world with a confidence and a competence that is specifically hers, earned and undeniable. Uncle is there, because Uncle is always there, still finding ways to not quite pull his weight while being there, which is its own kind of consistency. They buy Beecher's Hope, a piece of land in West Elizabeth, a real piece of land with a real deed, and John builds the house himself, mostly, with help. It is not beautiful, not at first, but it is theirs. Abigail and Jack move in. Uncle gets a room because of course he does. There are cattle to buy, and fences to build, and a barn that needs a roof, and all of it is work in the honest sense of the word. Effort that produces something tangible, something that can be pointed to, and then the final confrontation with Micah on Mount Hagen, which is necessary before any of this can feel clean. Dutch is there, which neither John nor Sadie nor Charles expected. It is Charles who spots him first. The standoff on the mountain in the snow has the quality of something closing, a circle completing. Dutch shoots Micah. John shoots Micah. The gold is there, all of it, the Blackwater gold that the gang spent years saying they were going to get to and never did, and none of the surviving people take it. None of them care. That gold is the object that Dutch organized his last decade around, the symbol of the escape that was always coming, always almost here, and it just sits there in the snow while the men who were willing to die for it walk away from it. Dutch leaves. He does not explain himself, or explains himself only obliquely, the way Dutch always did. John watches him go and does not stop him. He could. The law would have paid for Dutch, but John has never wanted to hand Dutch to the law. He wants to be done with it. He wants to go home. The years between the end of the epilogue and the beginning of Red Dead Redemption pass mostly off-screen. We know, from the first game, that they are not entirely peaceful years. John has more trouble leaving the past behind than the ranch represents. There are incidents. There is a shooting in Roanoke Ridge in 1907. The Bureau of Investigation and the Pinkerton Agency are both still interested in John Marston, even retired, because the law in this era operates with a patience and a memory that the people it watches sometimes forget about. Edgar Ross, who we have seen in the game as a quieter, more dangerous version of Andrew Milton, becomes a figure in what follows. He is the one who, in 1911, locates John and presents him with the proposition: hunt down the surviving members of your old gang, Bill Williamson and Javier Escuela and Dutch Vanderland, and in exchange the Bureau will leave John and his family alone. This is the engine of the original Red Dead Redemption, and it is not a generous offer. It is the law doing what the law always does, in this world, which is using people's most important vulnerabilities against them. Abigail and Jack are taken. John goes to New Austin in Mexico and West Elizabeth and does what he is asked to do, which takes most of a year. He finds Bill Williamson, who has been running a minor gang in New Austin, grown mean and paranoid and small, which is what some men grow when the structure that gave them context falls away. He finds Javier Escuela in Mexico, working for a revolutionary faction in ways that are complicated enough to warrant genuine sympathy, even from John, who has to bring him to heel. He finds Dutch Vanderland in a fort in the tall trees, and Dutch, confronted by the son he raised, steps off the cliff rather than be taken. John comes home. He thinks it is over. He has done what the Bureau asked him to do. He has given them everything they demanded, and he goes back to the ranch and to Abigail and to Jack. Ross brings a whole army to the ranch. John dies in the yard, outnumbered 20-1, going out with his guns in his hands, because there is no other way it was ever going to end for someone with John's history, once the law decided it needed him to be done. 3 years later, Jack kills Edgar Ross. It is neat, the neatness of something that has been going in one direction since before it started. Jack is 19 or so, has been a reader and a thinker, and someone his father hoped would avoid the life. And he goes to find Ross, and he finds him fishing on a lake in retirement, and he kills him. Whether this is justice or just more violence is a question the original game leaves open, which is the right choice. It feels like justice, in the way that things feel like justice, when they are really just consequences arriving in the form of a person. The whole story, from that campfire in the mid-1870s to Jack Marston walking away from a lakeside in New Austin in 1914, covers about 40 years. 40 years from the moment two young men tried to rob each other and laughed and started something to the moment the last consequence of that something plays out. Every death in those 40 years is connected to that campfire. Every life shaped by the gang is shaped by that moment, where Dutch van der Linde and Hosea Matthews decided that the company was better than the loneliness. Arthur Morgan is in the middle of all of it, spanning most of the decades, but not quite all of them. He is the heart of the story, the consciousness through which you understand what is actually happening and what it actually costs. He is the person who looked at the world he was given and tried, late in his life, but genuinely, and with everything he had left, to make it a little better before he left it. He has a grave, up in the mountains, depending on your honor, either simply marked or visited by deer in the way that the game uses deer as a kind of quiet symbol of the natural world, continuing past human drama. The grave says his name and the dates and nothing else. The dates are all you need. They tell the whole story, not a long life and a violent one, and toward the end of it, a life that he tried to live right. That is what the game is about, when you strip everything else away. Not Dutch's philosophy or the closing frontier, or even the gang as an institution. It is about whether a person who has done violent and wrong things can find a version of themselves worth being before it is too late. And the answer the game gives is, yes, probably. But it is harder than anyone tells you, and it costs more than the stories suggest, and the time you have is shorter than you think. Section 12. The small stories inside. The big one lore, legend, and the world that lives around the edges. One of the things that makes Red Dead Redemption 2 feel like an actual place rather than a backdrop is that it never stops being a world when you are not looking at it. The main story is the main story, enormous and emotionally dense and demanding of your full attention. But around and underneath and alongside that story, the game has built an entire world full of things that have nothing to do with Dutch or Arthur or the Pinkertons. Things that are simply there, woven into the fabric of the landscape, waiting to be discovered or not discovered, mattering to the people in them whether or not anyone ever pays attention. There is a man in the Grizzlies who has been writing letters to his wife for longer than anyone should. You can find the letters. They are increasingly incoherent, increasingly desperate, written by someone who started out just isolated and gradually became something more troubling. The narrative of that man's deterioration is told entirely through found documents in an abandoned cabin, without any cutscene or mission or character to explain it to you. The game simply leaves it there, in the snow, for whoever has the patience and the curiosity to piece together what happened. There is a strange man. He appears to Arthur at various points in the game, always in unexpected places, and he speaks in ways that suggest he knows more about what is happening than he should. His dialogue is elliptical and slightly unsettling in the way of things that are trying to tell you something important without saying it directly. He is dressed in a fine suit, and he carries himself with the ease of someone for whom time is not the pressing concern. It is for everyone around him. Players have argued about who or what the strange man is since the original Red Dead Redemption, in which he also appeared. The clearest reading of the evidence is that he is something like death, or fate, or the moral accounting that runs beneath the surface of the story, made briefly, incomprehensibly, into a person you can look at. He appears in a mirror in a shack at the end of the epilogue, whole and present and visible to John for the first time. He turns and walks away. That is all the explanation you are going to get. The ghost of a murdered woman, killed by her husband, whose presence can be witnessed at a specific location, at a specific time of night. She does not speak. She does not attack. She simply appears and then fades. A disturbance in the landscape, a story that ended badly and has not entirely finished ending. The game contains a significant number of these kind of encounters, things that are neither explained nor withheld, but simply placed in the world as things that exist in it. The cult in the mountains, a group that has established a commune at a location in the Grizzlies, their buildings painted with symbols, their routine legible from observation. They are not hostile unless provoked. They are simply there, a whole community with a whole belief system that the game never explains but allows to exist. What they believe, whether it is a good thing or a bad thing, whether the people in it are there by choice or by circumstance, all of this is left to the observer's interpretation. The survivalist challenges, the hunting challenges, the legendary animals scattered through the world's wild places. The bison on the plains, the legendary bear Arthur and Hosea nearly die hunting in the grizzlies, the giant snake in the swamps, the white Arabian horse that can be found and tamed in the wild north, living alone in the snow with no explanation for how it got there. These creatures are not story critical. They are the world's offer to you, an invitation to be present in the landscape without the story requiring you to be there. Valentine is worth spending time with as a location, even when nothing is required of you there. The town has a rhythm to it, a daily pattern. The cattle come through on the drives, and the cowboys drive them through with an expertise born of repetition. The saloon fills up after dark with people who have specific reasons to be there, specific histories that the overheard dialogue suggests without spelling out. The doctor's office deals with injuries from the cattle work and from the town's regular Saturday violence. The sheriff handles what he can handle and lets go of what he cannot. It is a working town with working people, and it functions whether or not Arthur Morgan ever sets foot in it. St. Denis is the game's most fully realized urban environment, and it is deliberately overwhelming the first time you enter it. The streets crowded and loud, and full of the particular chaos of a city that has grown faster than its capacity to absorb the growth. The electric lights are on a newer street, surrounded by the older gaslit streets, the two systems overlapping in the way that transitions always overlap in the real world. Street musicians, street vendors, an opera house, a police force with jurisdiction over a city rather than scattered outposts, and it conducts itself accordingly. There is an entire St. Denis criminal underworld that Arthur encounters through Angelo Bronte, the crime lord who controls much of the city's illegal economy and who comes to a spectacularly bad end at Dutch's hands, which is one of the moments that makes it clear Dutch is no longer operating within even his own moral framework. The swamps of Lemoyne between St. Denis and the rest of the world are not just scenic, they are dangerous in specific, accurate ways. The alligators are enormous and patient, and the game does not make a joke out of them. They are the apex predators of that environment, and they behave accordingly, wading in the water with the patience of something that has been doing this for longer than anyone has been watching. The people who live in those swamps are people who have been pushed to the margins of the margins, people for whom the official civilization and its official economy have made no room, who have built something in the places nobody else wanted, and who are not always safe to approach, and who are sometimes more interesting than the people in the towns, the Braithwaite and Gray families of Lemoyne. This is a secondary conflict in the game's middle chapters, and it is handled with a thoroughness that makes it feel like a real long-running feud rather than a backdrop element. The Braithwaites have the horses and the plantation history, and a particular kind of old money arrogance that has curdled over generations. The Grays have the law, more or less, the local sheriff being firmly in their pocket, and a willingness to use legal violence where the Braithwaites use social violence. They have been at each other for long enough that neither side can quite remember what it was originally about, which is how most long-running conflicts work. The gang plays both sides for a while, which goes approximately as well as playing both sides of anything goes, which is to say, badly. The Braithwaite family keeps something hidden that becomes relevant to the main story in a way I will not detail here, but which says something about the particular combination of wealth and cruelty and entitlement that the family represents. The Grays are not better in any meaningful moral sense, just differently positioned in the local hierarchy. The conflict between them is the Civil War still happening 30 years later in miniature, the same division of loyalties, and the same refusal to let old wounds close. The oil fields in the north, Ansburg and the coal mines and the workers in them, men with black lung and wages that do not justify what the work costs them, living in company towns where the company owns the store and the company owns the housing, and the company therefore owns the workers, in the practical sense, even if not the legal one. This is historical. The company town was a real institution of that era, a mechanism for capturing labor that the industrial economy had refined over decades. Arthur encounters workers in these towns, and the details of their situation are not softened. The game knows what it is describing, and describes it accurately. The train robberies the gang conducts throughout the game are the activity that makes the most narrative sense as their primary work, because the railroad is the visible symbol of the new order pressing in, and robbing it is, within the gang's logic, a meaningful act of resistance, as well as a practical one. The trains carry payroll and cash shipments and wealthy passengers and the infrastructure of a commercial system that has, in Dutch's view, no more right to what it carries than the people who would take it. This view is partially correct and partially self-serving, and the game knows that both things are true simultaneously. The legendary gunfighters that Arthur can encounter, old men mostly, who carry histories of violence that the world used to have use for and is now in the process of forgetting. They are living artifacts of the earlier West, the pre-1899 version, where a fast draw was a genuine credential. They are suspicious of younger men who might want to test them. They are lonely in the way of people who define themselves by something the world has stopped needing. Some of them are dangerous, and some of them are just old, and Arthur's confrontations with them have a quality of two different eras touching briefly before moving apart. The herbalism and the hunting and the crafting systems are not lore, exactly, but they are part of how the world communicates its relationship to the natural world and to the skills that would have sustained a person in it. Arthur knows how to find medicinal plants. He knows which animals are edible and how to prepare them. He knows how weather changes, hunting conditions, and how to read the landscape for where animals will be. This knowledge is not made exotic or mystical. It is just knowledge, practical and specific and earned, the kind that you get from paying attention to the world you live in rather than moving through it without noticing. The world of Red Dead Redemption 2 is a world that rewards noticing. It does not demand that you notice. You can play the main story missions and encounter the world only as much as the story requires, and you will still experience an extraordinary game. But if you stop, if you sit on a rock above the plains at dusk and just watch the light change, if you follow a strange sound into a wood and find something that is not a mission at all but a situation, a story fragment, a moment of something that the game put there for no reason except that real places have things in them that are not about you, the experience becomes something else. It becomes a place rather than a game, a world rather than a story. That is what Rockstar built here, not just a story, though the story is extraordinary, a world. And the story lives inside the world, the way real stories live inside real worlds, which is in specific moments and specific people and specific things that are true about a particular time and place and would not be true anywhere else. You can go back to it. That is the thing about a world rather than just a story. The story ends. The world is still there. The horse still waits at the hitching post outside the saloon in Valentine. The snow still falls in the Grizzlies. The stars over the plains are still the specific stars that appear when you ride far enough from the towns and let the light pollution of 1,899 fall behind you. The world is still there, holding all of it, waiting for the next time you want to be inside it. A final reflection, the kind of story this is. There is a specific kind of story that Red Dead Redemption 2 belongs to, one that does not have a triumphant ending, because a triumphant ending would be dishonest about what the story is actually describing. It is the kind of story where the tragedy is not a mistake or an accident, but a consequence, where the things that go wrong are the direct outgrowth of the things that were always a little wrong, the cracks that were in the foundation before the building went up. Dutch van der Linde did not become what he became because of bad luck or an enemy who outsmarted him. He became what he became because the vision was always slightly too large for the man holding it, and the man could never entirely admit this, and the gap between the vision and the reality required an ever-increasing cost to be maintained. Arthur Morgan is the person we spend the game inside, and Arthur's arc is the arc of someone arriving at honesty, which sounds like a small thing until you sit with how much courage honesty actually requires. Being honest with yourself about who you are and what you have done, and what that has cost other people, is not comfortable work. It is the kind of work that most people, in any era, find reasons to postpone. Arthur postpones it for most of his life and then finds, when he cannot postpone it anymore, that it is the most important work he has ever done. The journal is the visible record of that work. In the early pages, it is the notes of a man doing his job, competent and observant, and not particularly reflective. In the later pages, it is something else, something closer to a conversation with himself, or maybe a conversation with whoever might read it, though Arthur presumably did not expect anyone to read it. He sketches the mountains and the plains with a care and an attention that suggests he has been paying that kind of attention for a long time, maybe always, without knowing what to do with it. The illness gives him permission to let himself be the kind of person who sketches mountains, who thinks about things, who tries to understand what his life has been and what it could still mean. The journal ends before the story does. Arthur's last entry is not a summation. It is just another day, another observation. The world's still there and still worth noting. This is the right choice. Summations are for people who get to plan their endings. Arthur's ending comes in the middle of his living, which is how most endings come, and the journal that survives him is the evidence that he was paying attention while he was here. What does it mean to play this game? What do you carry out of it? You carry the geography, probably. The specific quality of the light in the morning when you ride west out of Valentine, and the sun is just coming up over the plains, and the world is gold and quiet for about 30 seconds before something happens. The way the grizzlies look in the snow, the silence that is total except for the wind, the swamps of Lemoyne at dusk, when the fireflies start and the herons are coming into land and the Spanish moss on the cypress trees moves in the evening air. The game built a world that is not real, but has the emotional weight of real places, which means it becomes a place you remember the way you remember places you have been. You carry the characters. Dutch at his best, the campfire speeches, the warmth, Hosea's particular kind of dry, affectionate wisdom, Arthur writing in his journal by firelight, Sadie after she has decided what she is and who she is and nothing is going to change that, Charles's silence that is never empty, the specific way John loves Abigail, which is not smooth or eloquent but is genuine and persistent and survives everything the world throws at it. You carry the questions about loyalty and what it owes, about whether a person who has done wrong things can be, in the end, a good person, about what it costs to live in a world that is changing around you without asking your permission, about what you hold on to and what you let go, when holding on and letting go both have a price. These are not questions that have easy answers. The game does not give you easy answers. It gives you Arthur Morgan, dying, watching the sunrise, saying that he tried. And it trusts you to understand that trying is not nothing, that in the specific circumstances of a specific life, trying can be everything. The West is gone now, in the sense that 1,899 meant when it used the word. The frontier was declared closed in 1890 by the Census Bureau, which is a strange way to close a frontier, by bureaucratic announcement, but is perhaps fitting for an era in which bureaucracy was the advancing edge of exactly the kind of civilization Dutch was raging against. The landscape is still there, most of it, the mountains and the plains and the rivers. The light still hits them the way it hit them in 1899 in the early morning, when there is nobody around and the world is just itself for a moment before the day begins. Arthur Morgan is in that light, in the sense that characters and stories that are well told never entirely leave the light they were first seen in. He is there in the particular quality of early morning in high country, in the silence before the wind comes up, in the way a deer will look at you from the tree line and hold the look for one long moment before it decides to trust the distance and stays. He tried. In the end, he did. That is enough. It has always been enough. And this story, the whole enormous, sprawling, beautiful, sad story of Dutch van der Linde and his family of outlaws, will be worth your time every single time you sit down with it, because the best stories are the ones that know what they are about and do not flinch from it. And Red Dead Redemption 2 knows exactly what it is about and tells you true. Closing thoughts. What the West was. Red Dead Redemption 2 is not really a game about the West in the way a John Ford movie is about the West. It is a game about what the West meant and what happens when the thing a story is built around turns out to have been fading even while people were living it. The frontier was always going to close. The railroads were always going to come. The oil companies were always going to find the land useful. The men with the most money were always going to hire enough violence to impose their version of order. That is not a unique thing about this era or this place. That is just power working the way power works, which is efficiently in the direction of more power. What makes 1,899 remarkable is that it is visible. The transition is visible in a way that transitions usually are not, because most change happens slowly enough that the people inside it do not feel it happening. In 1899, you can see both things at once. The old world still present enough to touch, still warm, still there in the faces of people who remember when it was different. And the new world already arrived in most of the ways that matter, already threading its infrastructure through the old landscape, already making certain things impossible that used to be possible. The Vanderlinde Gang is a community of people caught in that transition, trying to find a way to keep being who they are in a world that has decided their kind of person is no longer viable. Most of them do not make it. The ones who do make it do so by holding on to something specific and real, not Dutch's abstractions about freedom or the mythology of the outlaw life, but the actual people they love, the actual responsibilities they have, the actual things they can make with their hands and their time. Arthur figured that out, eventually. Not early enough to change the outcome, but early enough to matter. He tried. In the end, he did. The light comes up over the mountains, and the deer move through the tree line, and the world continues past everyone in it, past every name and every story, past all the graves and all the campfires and all the speeches that were good enough to hold people together for a little while before the world moved on. That is what you carry out of this story. Not the plot, exactly. Not just the events in sequence, but the feeling of it. The quality of that particular melancholy that comes from watching something genuinely beautiful that also cannot last. It could not last. Nothing this particular ever does. But it was here. They were here. And for a little while, around a campfire in the mountains, two men who tried to rob each other started building something that felt like it might matter. It did matter. It just could not matter forever. And maybe that is enough.